Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on understanding post-market surveillance under EU MDR, being proactive, not reactive. I'm Jessica Lyons. I'm a senior customer success expert here at Greenlight, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's event. We have got a great presentation scheduled for you guys today. Our presenter, Carolyn Guthrie, she is really looking forward to being able to share her insights and expertise on post-market surveillance as it relates to the new requirements in EU MDR. Before we dive into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and her consultancy, Capstone Medical, I want to touch on a couple of items really quickly. First, today's webinar is about 60 minutes in total, including a Q&A session at the end, where Carolyn is going to be kind enough to answer all of your questions. So I encourage you to submit those questions throughout the webinar as they come up. There is a box on the right-hand side as part of the GoToWebinar, and we'll make sure that we get to as many of them as time permits. Second, I want to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know that we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you on today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We are constantly looking for ways to fulfill that, whether it's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Carolyn Guthrie, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management system, I encourage you to head on over to greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn about how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our eQMS software to gain ISO 13485-2016 certification, market approval, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to achieve true quality. So if you're interested in learning how we can help your device company, make sure you visit greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter, a distinguished partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Carolyn Guthrie. Carolyn serves as the Director of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance for Capstone Medical, a single source service provider to medical device companies lacking the appropriate human capital to commercialize new and safe products. Originally from South Africa, Carolyn is now based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. She has been in the medical device industry in quality and regulatory functions for the past 15 years, working for and with both large corporations and startup companies with a single employee. The types of devices she has worked with has varied from in vitro diagnostic devices to orthopedic, dental, software, and even kitting, packaging, and sterilization devices. Carolyn has experience globally with a focus on North America and Europe in both the pre-market and post-market quality and regulatory functions, including pre-market submissions, 510Ks and CE mark, as well as day-to-day operations in quality assurance and quality systems. She holds a BS in biochemistry and microbiology and an MS in human cell biology from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and an MS in Regulatory Affairs International from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. In addition, she is a RAC, so Regulatory Affairs Professional certification for the US. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Carolyn. One thing as a reminder, today's presentation is being recorded and it will be made available for the attendees as well as anyone who registered. Thank you for submitting that question, guys. Okay, Carolyn?
All right, well, thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, at least in the US East Coast, to everybody. I realize I may have not done some slides as you were talking, Jessica, so I'm sorry. But let me just quickly get to the point where I want to stop. So Good afternoon, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. Just a quick note on Capstone Medical. As Jessica mentioned, we're a single source service provider to medical device companies lacking the appropriate human capital to commercialize a new and safe product. Our services span 5 main areas: product development, quality assurance, regulatory affairs, intellectual property strategy, and manufacturing solutions. Our quality support includes implementing or upgrading quality management systems to the latest FDA and ISO requirements. We offer assistance to companies big to small in the American and European markets, as well as others across the globe. Our regulatory track records total decades of experience and dozens of successful submissions spanning multiple sub-industries in the medical device field. So without further ado, I am going to start on my presentation. Just a quick overview. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing post-market surveillance. So in case anyone's in the wrong webinar, that's what we're going to be discussing, and specifically pertaining to the new requirements under the EU medical device regulations. As this is such a big topic, I'll just be providing a concise and understanding of the following topics. We're going to discuss post-market surveillance requirements, how to integrate this into your current quality management system. We're going to discuss the impact to your business, also understanding the relationship between post-market surveillance, risk management, and clinical evaluation. And then finally, touching on what needs to be included in your post-market surveillance plans and reports. Also, as this is driven by the regulations themselves, some of my slides are quite word heavy, so I apologize in advance, but I wanted to make sure that you are seeing the regulations as they are written. So before I start on the new requirements under the EU MDR, I just wanted to touch on an understanding, or at least I feel it's important to understand that the requirements for post-market surveillance is not a new requirement in the EU. It is now, however, a legally required activity under the new medical device regulations, and it has more prescriptive measures on what is expected and how to achieve it. Most manufacturers fall short of the current requirements. The new PMS requirements will go into enforcement on May 2020, but I'm going to show you or touch on the current requirements to impress upon you that you need to be taking action now, regardless of that enforcement date. The directive in the directive in Annex 2, which is your full quality assurance system, it requires a manufacturer to institute and maintain an up-to-date systematic procedure to review experience gained from devices in the post-production phase and implement the appropriate means to apply any necessary corrective action. Also, the various MedDev documents and requirements within the harmonized standards provide additional guidance on how this was intended to be achieved and demonstrated. And here's just an overview of these MedDev documents that are currently, these are the current revisions and currently what is available. So much of the content of these MedDev documents has now been codified into the new medical device regulations. A note on these MedDev documents currently, it is anticipated that the guidelines will be followed unless there is a national legislation that differs. So if your organization has been following these documents, your adoption of the new regulations is going to be somewhat simpler. Also, just to touch on the current requirements, as stated in Annex 2 of the current directive, the notified body must audit the quality system to determine whether it meets the requirements referred to in Section 3.2, which is just a section that goes over what's required of the quality management system. So it must presume that the quality systems which implement the relevant harmonized standards conform to these requirements. ISO 13485 is a harmonized standard, and specifically 2016, it's used to demonstrate conformance to those requirements. And so 2016 actually states the following within Section 8.2, that the organization shall document procedures for the feedback process. I won't go through everything, but it talks about gathering data from production as well as post-production activities, using that as an input into risk management, and if applicable, regulatory requirements required, which it does with the EU MDR, that you're required to gain specific experience from post-production activities. So again, just reiterating, if you're certified to 2016, you already are required to be performing post-market surveillance activities. So now on to what this presentation is all about, the new requirements of post-market surveillance under the EU MDR. So let's discuss these requirements. this slide is just giving you a framework of the new medical device regulation requirements around post-market activities. This includes both proactive and reactive elements of the post-market surveillance process and the associated sections in the MDR. I'm not going to be going into each of these in detail in the webinar, but I will demonstrate as far as possible how many of these systems are interrelated to each other. All of the systems, if you want to call them systems, processes, elements, but all of these systems need to be considered under post-market activities. Some of them, such as risk management and clinical evaluation, have pre-market activities associated with them, and certain plans are required as part of your technical documentation. So there is some, these are all considered post-market activities, but some need to be considered in pre-market activities as well. So now to get down to the nitty-gritty of the regulation. I think it's important to understand how post-market surveillance is actually defined in the medical device regulations, as this definition is what drives the further requirements within the regulation. Article 2, Section 60, which is the article with the definition, states post-market surveillance is defined as all activities carried out by manufacturers in cooperation with other economic operators to institute and keep up to date a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market, make available on the market, or put into service for the purpose of identifying any need to immediately apply any necessary corrective actions. So I've highlighted in red what I feel is the crux of the definition, and it falls on two words specifically: systematic and proactively. So what we're looking at here, systematic, it can be further interpreted to indicate the requirements for integration into a manufacturer's quality management system through development and implementation of procedures. And then further, according to these procedures, to have a defined plan in place for each device or device family. Important here, and I will touch on it later, procedure and plan, they are not the same thing. So systematic, and great way of creating systematic process is incorporating into procedures. Then proactively, so proactively can be further interpreted to basically say what you've been doing in the past will no longer be sufficient. So it's never really been sufficient, but we're not going to go there again. All I'm saying is gone are the days where you can point to your complaint system as your post-market surveillance activity. It's no longer going to be sufficient. So there is a full section of a chapter dedicated to post-market surveillance in the EU MDR. This is Chapter 7, Section 1. Article 83 it discusses the responsibility or describes the responsibilities of the manufacturer related to post-market surveillance. So it specifically states, for each device, manufacturers shall plan, establish, document, implement, maintain, and update a post-market surveillance system in a manner that is proportionate to the risk class and appropriate for the type of device. This shall be an integral part of the quality management system. And secondly, post-market surveillance systems shall be suited to actively and systematically gathering, recording, and analyzing data on the quality, performance, and safety of the device throughout its lifetime. And of course, based on those conclusions, determining whether there's any preventable corrective actions. Again, I've highlighted what I feel are the critical words in red: proportionate to risk class and type of device, actively and systematically, and throughout the entire lifetime. I will touch on ways, talking about proportionate to the risk class, I'm going to touch on ways how you want to incorporate the risk class and proportionate later in the presentation. We've already touched on previously on what active and systematic approach to PMS is. So lastly, lifetime. This is intended to highlight the requirement for considering performance and safety of the device throughout the claimed lifetime of the device based on its clinical application. So it's not just until, it's not shelf life, it's not just until you sell it to the customer. This is throughout the entire, or it needs to be considered throughout the entire lifetime of that device. So at this point, I think you're starting to see the general intent of the requirements. There's an organizational requirement to have an active role in maintaining the safety and performance of the device and consider it for the lifetime of the device. So As previously mentioned, many companies have performed post-market surveillance activities. However, these have been very much reactive, or in other words, you haven't specifically planned for them. They're just sort of given to you. Some of these common reactive approaches to post-market surveillance have, of course, been complaints, non-conforming reports, or any other issues that you've seen in manufacturing, anything related to service records if applicable to your type of device, vigilance and vigilance reporting, literature reviews, which is really not a proactive, it's a reactive approach to post-market surveillance because you're relying on other people's data. And then, of course, review of national or regional registries, which again, the reason that that's reactive is it's out of the control of the manufacturer. So what the new MDR is really looking for is the manufacturer to proactively collect the data on their device before a deficiency is found. Some proactive approaches can include post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF for short, registries and registry studies, which are driven by the manufacturer. So you have specific endpoints that you are looking for your specific device, experience with similar devices, carrying out focus groups to obtain information, or customer surveys and user feedback. So I just want to quickly touch on post-market clinical follow-up. So this is the first time I'm introducing this term. We will touch on it a little later in the presentation, but I just want to make sure that there's an understanding of what this is. So in short, the PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up requirements, are outlined in Annex 14, Part B of the EU MDR. And as directly quoted from Annex 14, PMCF shall be understood to be a continuous process that updates the clinical evaluation referred to in Article 61, which discusses clinical evaluation, and Part A of this annex, and shall be addressed in a manufacturer's post-market surveillance plan. When conducting PCMF, the manufacturer shall proactively collect and evaluate clinical data from the use in or on humans of a device which bears the CE marking and is placed on the market or put into service within its intended use. It's with the aim of confirming safety and performance throughout the expected lifetime and ensuring continued acceptability of identified risks. So it's a post-market activity. However, the plan is required to be submitted as part of the clinical evaluation in your technical documentation, but it's driven by the PMS process. So now that we know how to collect the data and where we're sourcing the data from, we need to get an understanding of, well, what are you going to do with that data? Article 83 actually gives you the expectations of what you need to do with this data. Data gathered by the manufacturer's post-market surveillance system will be, in particular, be used for, and it's for updating certain documents, identifying certain data points, I guess, and then, when we go into detail. So you're updating your benefit risk determination. You're improving risk management, you're updating any design and manufacturing information, any labeling, the clinical evaluation, and then your summary of safety and clinical performance. You're also identifying any potential corrective or preventive action needs, any field safety corrective actions that need to be taken, and identifying any improvements to the device. As shown on the previous slide, under the data sources, experience with similar devices is considered a proactive data source for post-market surveillance. So the data that you're collecting for one device can contribute to the post-market surveillance data of another device. And then lastly, this information that you collect is going to be used for trend reporting, which I will touch on a little bit later. So depending on the outcomes of your updates, your identifications, and things like that, you're going to update technical documentation accordingly. And again, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on what type of technical documentation. So now you're starting to get an idea of these new requirements. If you look at some of what I've highlighted: design and manufacturing, labeling, risk management, preventive or corrective actions, trending. So you're starting to get an understanding of, okay, how am I going to incorporate this into my quality management system, and what processes may be interrelated. One of the next requirements of the new EU MDR is in Article 84, which is the post-market surveillance plan. So this is now one of the newer requirements of the MDR, to have a documented plan for each device or device family. Article 84 specifically states that the post-market surveillance system referred to in Article 83 shall be based on a post-market surveillance plan, and those requirements are set out in Annex 3. And that this plan is part of the technical documentation specified in Annex 2, and Annex 2 talks about technical documentation specific to the device. This is not technical documentation of a PMS system, it's to the device. So going a little bit further into Annex 3, so Article 84 details that you or defines that you need a plan. Annex 3 helps to or provides some guidelines on what is expected to appear and be considered in the plan. So as defined in Annex 3, it discusses the technical documentation requirements of post-market surveillance. So the post-market surveillance plan shall address, and I'll show you the actual verbiage on the next slide, but in short, it shall address collection and utilization of particular available information, and that the plan shall cover things like processes, methods, acceptance criteria, etc. So more specifically, Annex 3 states the following, and this is what I was saying about being very wordy. The post-market surveillance plan shall address the collection and utilization of available information, in particular information of serious accidents, including information from, this is one of your reports, the periodic safety update report and field safety corrective actions, records related to non-serious incidents, data on undesirable effects, trend reporting, literature or specialist data, feedback, publicly available information. So much of this will sound familiar as we've touched on it in the data sources slide, but what this is telling us is what it needs to be outlined as data sources in the plan itself. So you'll hear me say this throughout. You'll define types of data sources in your procedure, but your plan is going to tell you specifically for your device or device family what you're going to be looking for and looking at. So some of this data will be readily available. That's our reactive, the reactive data sources. So complaints, feedback, non-serious events and things like that. And some will require an outline of collection and analysis methods, your trend reporting, how to incorporate information from registries and things like that. The next slide is, again, very wordy, and I apologize for that, but this is also directly from Annex 3, discussing the post-market surveillance plan. So previous slide, it tells us what it needs to, the data that you need to collect. This is now showing what your plan needs to cover. So it's providing guidance on how your PMS process needs to be performed. Again, the plan is device specific, but this gives guidance on what the process at least needs to consider. Annex 3, it's 1.1b, the post-market surveillance plan shall cover at least proactive and systematic process to collect the information, effective and appropriate methods to assess the collected data, indicators and threshold values for that continued reassessment of your benefit risk analysis and risk management, methods to investigate complaints, analyze data. So I'm not going to go through each one, but you're getting the idea. This is telling you how to go about analyzing the data that you've collected. So, in my opinion, even though post-market surveillance has, become a bigger topic in the EU MDR, they've done a very good job of telling you what they're looking for. Then once you've collected all of your data, there are reporting requirements under the new EU MDR. So the first one is called the post-market surveillance report. It's intended for low-risk Class 1 devices and needs to summarize the results and conclusions of the post-market surveillance data, along with a rationale and description of any corrective actions taken for products on the market. It gets included with the technical documentation, it's updated when necessary, and it's made available on request. Then the more, and of course, more wordy one, but the more, more stringent requirement is around the periodic safety update report. So this is intended for higher risk devices. It also summarizes the results and conclusions of your post-market surveillance data, but it requires additional information on other post-market information, vigilance reporting, the current status of the devices on the market. It also requires a rationale and description of any corrective actions taken for products on the market. and everything else in this slide. So it details what it's looking for in the periodic safety update report. So you're looking for conclusions of your benefit risk determination, any main findings from your post-market clinical follow-up, volume of sales, usage frequency of the device, and things like that. I'm not going to go over the rest because my next slide summarizes this quite nicely. So the reporting requirements of the requirements of each of these reports is as follows. We've got the classifications along the top according to the classifications for medical devices under EU MDR, including a separate section for implantable, even though they may fall into a class 2B or 3. It's been specifically brought out as a higher risk category. So class 1, if we're looking on the left-hand side, class 1 requires that post-market surveillance report. It's updated as necessary, and it's made available to the competent authorities on request. So there's no notified body. They can request it, of course, but it needs to be made available to the competent authority at least. Then you have your class 2A, 2B, 3, and implantables. They require that periodic safety update report. It's required to be done throughout the lifetime of the device. Reporting requirements do differ between the lower of the high risk class, I guess the medium risk. So class 2A, you're required to update this as necessary, but at least every 2 years. The remaining high risk devices require update of this periodic safety update report at least annually. For these medium and high risk devices, they do have notified body involvement. The class 2As and Bs, they just need to be made available to the notified body and also made available to the competent authority. But for class 3s and implantables, they actually need to be submitted electronically to the notified body. And the notified body will review and evaluate the data, and they'll make it available to the competent authorities. So, and that's a typo, meant to say by the NB, by the notified body. And then the final article that discusses post-market surveillance in the new EU MDR is Article 88, which is the trend reporting. And we've touched on it, well, at least I've touched on it every now and then. It's part of what's required to be considered in your post-market surveillance plan. So manufacturers shall report by means of the electronic system referred to in Article 92, which is just discussing that electronic system, any statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity of incidents. So that's one, and then the manufacturer shall specify how to manage the incident. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is something that needs to be considered within your post-market surveillance plan, is how you're going to manage the trend reporting of basically anything that you find that comes out of your post-market surveillance data collection, but more specifically on a incident or event basis. But really, this needs to be covered from many of the data sources to understand how you can do trend reporting. All right, so now that I've gone over what's required, what's actually required straight from the EU MDR regulations themselves, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can integrate the post-market surveillance requirements into your current quality management system. So Article 10 discusses the general obligations of a manufacturer, and then specific to Section 9I, it says the quality management system shall address at least the following aspects: setting up, implementation, and maintenance of the post-market surveillance system in accordance with Article 83. Just, showing you that there's a requirement stated in there that you do need to incorporate this into your quality management system. So how do you go about doing that? The most important one is start simple. There is no reason to try and overcomplicate your own processes to try and include every single detail of the EU MDR. Make it simple. Basically, consider any procedure where product performance data is gathered or evaluated, and link that to your post-market surveillance data procedure. So a good way of doing this is to create a process interaction flowchart. Mark out where you need to incorporate and link the new elements of the PMS to the other elements of your current quality system. This flowchart can be used as high-level evidence of a process approach defined in ISO 13485-2016. So already you're needing some sort of process approach flowchart in ISO 13485-2016. It's a good approach to include in your quality manual to show how your process is interlinked. So use what you already have if you have it, and add on. And then the flowchart can be used as high-level evidence of that process approach, but it will succinctly depict the process interactions required by the EU MDR. So here is just a quick example of a process flowchart specific to post-market surveillance. And again, very rough, but it's just showing an understanding, and actually better to have separate arrows to show separate directions. But really, here's your post-market surveillance. In the middle is your post-market surveillance process, and it's just showing interrelation to how it feeds into risk management, how it feeds into clinical evaluation, your plans, your reports, how that feeds into how you take the data and feed it into those, how that feeds into the UDAMED, which is your database. And then again, using complaints as an input, post-market surveillance can feed into your CAPA process, it can feed into your design, and feed into your manufacturing. So really what I'm trying to show here is take the regulation, sketch out what processes are going to be touched, current ones, or if you need to create new ones, and map out how they interrelate to each other. So once you do that, you can you can really start to incorporate into your quality management system. So the following are linkages that you need to consider. They were not all considered in my quick flow chart, but you need to sort of take into account design and development. So if post-market surveillance information may be relevant for products that are in development right now, you need to consider that. Your feedback and complaint handling process, your field action process, management review, risk management, your technical documentation procedure, labeling, clinical evaluation, CAPA, any of your reporting requirements, your summaries, and then any regulatory communication. So this is just showing you some of the linkages that you may need to consider. Also, I see I wrote up there common terminology, and what I wanted to sort of keep in mind with that is there's so much terminology used in clinical evaluation, risk management, now post-market surveillance. Make sure that you're using common terminology throughout your quality management system so that it's easy to understand how one process feeds into another. Probably most important between clinical evaluation and post-market surveillance. So once you've determined all your interactions, take each procedure and advise to ensure that you take into consideration the requirements of the regulation, and don't forget the MedDev. So even though a lot of that has been codified, still refer to the MedDev documents just to make sure that you're incorporating all guidance that you can. Ensure the linkages are clear, and ensure that there's a clear strategy on how PMS implementation is going to be performed. So don't make your procedures ambiguous. Just remember, make it simple and make it clear. And again, I'm going to touch on this. Remember that these are your procedures. So they should describe the requirements of your planning and the requirements of your implementation, but they do not take the place of separately required post-market surveillance or post-market clinical follow-up plans. Those are required separately for each device or device family. And earlier on, I'd mentioned, or it states in Article 83 for the post-market surveillance system for of the manufacturer, that for each device, manufacturer shall plan, establish, document, implement, maintain, and update a PMS system in a manner that is proportionate to the risk class and appropriate for the type of device. So I just wanted to touch on this. How can one do this? So you need to develop a method on how to differentiate your risk class, and this should be included in your post-market surveillance procedures. And then specific considerations and resulting requirements can be detailed in your post-market surveillance plan for that specific device. So the types of things that you need to consider when you're differentiating according to risk is history of the clinical performance of this device or similar devices on the market, the intended use of the device, which links directly to classification in most cases, and then of course the maturity stage of the device. So these are just the types of things that you can consider as part of as part of your integrating into your procedures. Actually, I think now, Jessica, we're going to stop and do that polling question. I meant to do it a little bit earlier, but if we can do that polling question.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Okay, everybody. Let's go through, answer really quickly. How many of you guys have started implementing any PMS activities under the new EU MDR? Pick one. We do have an unsure if you are not sure either A, what is included, or whether or not your company has actually started doing them. We'll give it just another minute. Okay. 75 people or 75% responded. 55% of you guys are saying yes, we have. 32% are saying no, and 13% of you are unsure.
Interesting. So you said 55% say yes, and I guess that's good. Rather 55 than 0. But for those of you who have not started, I encourage you to start now. Okay, interesting. Thank you. All right. So moving on now is understanding what the impact to the business is of the new EU MDR requirements. If you read the EU MDR, there are articles, but prior to the articles, and excuse my pronunciation of this, I get very mixed up on how to pronounce things at home versus the US. I'm going to call it the preface. I'm sure it's pronounced preface here, but the preface to the articles of the EU MDR carries some important information, and it gives us clues as to what is expected. Specifically, point 32 or step 32, section 32, whatever you'd like to call it, of the preface states that the device manufacturers are required to have a quality management system and a post-market surveillance system. Okay, so this one is obvious. If you don't have a quality management system in place right now, you may need to attend some additional webinars. This one may be a little premature for you, just saying. But there's a requirement for you to have a quality management system and a post-market surveillance system. So another important requirement is the concept of person responsible for regulatory compliance who fulfills minimum conditions of qualification. As we know from ISO 13485-2016, competence is a hot topic and a hot word. The EU MDR is requiring similar competences to be shown in place, in the post-market surveillance, as well as other specific references to qualifications. If you didn't have such as, in the clinical evaluation. If you do not have such in-house competences for regulatory and for clinical evaluation without solid qualifications, and they really do specify specifically in clinical evaluation what they're looking for, but regulatory compliance, you're looking for someone who has a correct background. It's usually looking at some sort of technology-based or biological-based background, but most importantly, experience in a regulatory professional environment. So if you do not have in-house competence of these requirements with a solid qualification, you're going to need to consider hiring resources through direct hire or at least through consulting companies to fulfill those competences if you're missing them. So some other considerations for impact to the business. One of them is the timeline for implementation. We're in May 2019 right now. So we're 12 months out from that enforcement date. So action is required now within your organization. Also consider resources for establishing, implementing, and maintaining this process. This includes resources not only upfront, but on an ongoing basis. Resources will be needed for performing the actual implement or establishing of the new procedure and process, but also needed for performing the collecting and evaluation of data, for writing of reports, for performing documentation updates to your risk, your benefit risk profile, your clinical evaluation, other technical documentation. And something very, very, very important to understand is that the responsibility for these post-market surveillance actions do not fall solely on the regulatory department of an organization. So this slide is just giving you an overview of some of the departments that are involved and should be involved in the post-market surveillance process. We have sales and marketing, quality assurance, customer service, clinical, regulatory affairs, service, and then other economic operators. So for example, your quality assurance department, they may assist in gathering of data from the reactive data sources, such as complaints, CAPAs, corrective actions, preventive actions. Regulatory will have access to the vigilance data, and they'll most likely be responsible for submission of those required reports. Clinical affairs are going to be critical to analyze data coming from your post-market clinical follow-up data. So as you can see, it's a organizational requirement, not just a regulatory requirement. And then just back to that slide, the impact to other economic operators needs to be understood. So we're talking about authorized reps, distributors, things like that. You need to understand that there is an impact to those economic operators to have their own systems in place, what they're going to provide back to you. You need to incorporate that into your procedures as well. So really that's the impact to the business that needs to be considered. Resources, time to implement, and understanding impact to other economic operators. And then finally, I'm going to get on to understanding the relationship between post-market surveillance, risk management, and clinical evaluation. So I'm going to make this really clear for you. Risk management feeds into post-market surveillance and clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation feeds into risk management and post-market surveillance. And post-market surveillance feeds into clinical evaluation and risk management. I am being somewhat humorous here because that is really what is required. They all feed into each other in some way. But a little bit more specifically, risk management, it feeds into your PMS and clinical evaluation. So as a pre-market activity, you're doing a risk assessment on your device. You're estimating severities and frequency of certain potential hazardous situations and subsequent harm. So, your risk management feeds immediately into your post-market surveillance and clinical evaluation there. Then your clinical evaluation data, you have your clinical evaluation report. That's confirming what was estimated during your risk assessment. So again, another pre-market activity. You're establishing the state of the art in your clinical evaluation report. And then that information is being provided as an input into what you need to consider for your post-market surveillance plan for a specific device. And that post-market surveillance plan includes post-market clinical follow-up plan. So really, the clinical evaluation pre-market is being used as an input into some post-market activities. And then, of course, post-market surveillance feeding into clinical evaluation and risk management. You're performing your post-market surveillance activities. This includes post-market clinical follow-up data and your periodic safety reports, and you're using that to continuously update your estimations of risk referred to in the first bullet point under risk assessment. So it's a sort of continuous circle of information and feeding into each other. So again, making that process interaction flowchart that I discussed earlier is a very important starting point for integrating the requirements into your quality management system. Now just to touch on a little bit onto the risk management in the EU MDR as related to post-market surveillance. So in Annex 1, which describes your general safety and performance requirements, it's section 3. It requires a risk management system that is continuous and iterative and requires systematic updating. So that's very important. It's continuous, like your post-market surveillance. It's entire lifetime of the device, regular systematic updating. So you need a procedure to drive that. And also then under section E, it says evaluate the impact of information from the production phase and in particular from the post-market surveillance system on hazards and the frequency of occurrence thereof on estimates of their associated risk. So it's basically what I touched on previously. But just to provide you a little bit more of a practical idea, this slide provides an overview of how you could and would incorporate risk into your PMS process and vice versa. So if you are familiar with ISO 14971, which is the risk management standard for medical devices. You have your risk management planning phase. So in this phase, you're defining risk ratings, risk acceptance, you're defining plans for post-launch risk management. But the output of one of the outputs of this as pertaining to post-market surveillance is post-market surveillance plan. So you've taken information from pre-market, from your clinical evaluation report, and your post-market surveillance plan is your output. You then have your risk assessment, which is your risk analysis and risk evaluation. So you've identified known and foreseeable hazards. You've estimated risk. Inputs into this on a continuous basis is production and post-production data, so your complaints, any reportable events, recall, safety alerts, and you re-estimate that risk and ensure that that residual risk remains acceptable. So outputs of this is into your quality management system. So you've used post-market surveillance data and you updating your risk management, and outputs could be any type of action, field action, CAPAs, incorporating this into your management review, and of course, updating your post-market surveillance plan if any data is not sufficient or there's new ways of managing this data. And then of course, you have your risk control phase. So you need to take into account any risk control measures that you put into place, and you need to update your risk files and trigger any safety alerts. And also, of course, updating your post-market clinical follow-up. Is there something else that you need to be evaluating? Any other type of clinical data that you need, and then doing your periodic risk-benefit analysis based on the data that you've collected. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on clinical evaluation in the EU MDR as it relates to post-market surveillance. So Article 61 discusses clinical evaluation, and specific to post-market surveillance, clinical evaluations of those products shall be based on relevant data concerning safety, including data from post-market surveillance clinical follow-up, and where applicable, specific clinical investigations. Again, you're hearing the words, it's clinical evaluation and its documentation updated throughout the life cycle of the device, from implementation of the post-market clinical follow-up plan and the post-market surveillance plan. So really what they're saying here is the interaction, it becomes a circular interaction. You have your clinical evaluation, but then you have your post-market surveillance plan, which follows any requirements from the your post-market clinical follow-up plan as driven by your post-market surveillance plan. And that drives continuous evaluation of any outcomes or findings from your original clinical evaluation, and you update that continuously. So again, it's just using the data that you're collecting over and over to update risk and clinical clinical data. And then this is actually my final slide, although I did touch on it in detail earlier, just a reminder of what that post-market clinical follow-up plan is. It's addressed specifically within Annex 14. It's a continuous process, updating of clinical evaluation, and addressed in your post-market surveillance plan. So I'm actually at the end now, but I just wanted to provide a quick summary of what we've discussed here, because we've covered a lot of data. So in summary, it's important to note that May 2020 enforcement date. So even if your device is still being distributed under an MDD certificate, that's fine. Your organization is required to comply with these new post-market surveillance requirements from the MDR enforcement date, which is May 2020. So you need to understand, you don't have until the expiration date of your certificate if it's beyond May 2020. You are required to be complying with the post-market surveillance requirements as of the enforcement date. Then, using the information in the EU MDR, develop your procedures to outline all the requirements and relationships of post-market surveillance under EU MDR. So develop your procedures using that sort of interactive flowchart. Then the next step, create your plans for your device or your device family. Again, these are not your procedures, but this is how you use your procedures to create your specific plans. Then carry out the process according to your plan. That's including collecting the data, evaluating the data, analyzing trends, and performing any updates as required on the risk, the benefit risk rate, documentation, your clinical evaluation, and any other technical documentation. And then finally, create your report and file or submit as required. So procedures, plans, process, and report. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. And I'm sure there's going to be questions because that was a lot of information. So Jessica, I'll hand it over to you.
One, thank you so much for such a great presentation. The questions have been pouring in since literally 8 minutes in. So we have a lot of questions to go through. I'm going to apologize in advance because there is no way that we are going to be able to cover all of these. However, Carolyn will have all of these questions, so she will be able to go through and she will be able to follow up. First question, based off of the presentation, complaints solely will not be sufficient for PMS, but can it still be an element of the PMS?
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether that was one of the earlier questions.
It was.
So as I pointed out in one of the slides, it's definitely one of the reactive data sources. So it has to be considered. I mean, that's really your direct feedback from the users. So it definitely needs to be considered within post-market surveillance. It's just one element though.
Does the proactive requirements applicable, are the proactive requirements applicable for Class 1 devices? What are the new considerations for Class 1 devices?
So again, it comes down to that proportionate risk. So you need to make your post-market surveillance process, proportionate to the type of device and the risk of or applicable to the type of device and proportionate to the risk. So I think, for a Class 1 device, it's of course less risky. So rather than try and say, I don't need to do the steps of post-market surveillance, follow the same steps, but reduce your overall requirements, maybe have higher trigger points for trending or things like that. So there's nothing that says Class 1 devices, this, and this needs to happen when you're doing your collection of data and analyzing of data. But just, you can reduce the trigger points or things like that. The only real difference where they call out Class 1 specifically is you're not required to submit a report, a periodic safety update report. So for this, you have reduced requirements in the reporting. You don't have to, you're only required to document your data collection and analyzing and, consider a rationale if no corrective actions are taken, and you just file that in your own technical documentation. So I'd say that's the only reduced requirement specifically.
Awesome. Another good question. So legacy devices, they can have a very well-known risk profile, little change in performance. Does the EU MDR give the option for the manufacturer to justify not conducting any active PMS data gathering or PMCF activity for such devices?
Absolutely. So you cannot give a rationale as to why you're not performing post-market surveillance. So that's absolutely not. You will still have to do that. But if you have sort of a good, if you have sufficient clinical data on that device itself, you can provide a justification as to why post-market clinical follow-up is not required. Absolutely. So that just needs to be incorporated into your post-market surveillance plan as to why there's no requirement for it. It doesn't mean you get away from post-market surveillance activities altogether. Just one element of it that you can justify not performing.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the other ones, some more details on trend reporting. So what exactly can we use to meet this requirement? What do we need to do for trend reporting?
Okay, so this one again, it really depends on the type of data that you are collecting. If you look at the intent of that, and I could go back to the slide, but if you're looking at the intent of that requirement, is they're wanting you, or in general, post-market surveillance, they're wanting you to understand how your device is performing on the market from a safety and performance perspective. So if you constantly getting complaints on or have there's incidents occurring on specific things, you need to understand at what point is this having an impact on the safety and performance of your device. So those trigger points I can't tell you, but that's the type of trending you need to do. And then to say, okay, based on this frequency of events, how does this impact my benefits risk profile? So specific to what you do, it's going to be dependent on your device and your organization and the type of device, things like that. Excuse me. But really it's looking at trigger points, threshold values. At what point is it not just it's not a safety thing, but, we need to consider a revision to our device design to consider additional human factor elements. It's that type of thing. So it really could be anything, but focus on safety and performance of the device and what is pushing you over a certain predetermined threshold of what's considered a serious incident, a non-serious incident, and things like that. Maybe a little vague, and if that question they want a little bit more detail, we can maybe go into detail offline. But it needs to be slightly device specific, and history of the device goes back to your risk, proportionate to risk, and things like that.
Okay, next question. So I understand the needs for active collection of PMS data. However, aren't needs for investigation, CAPA, risk management, and trending for the lifetime of the device already part of FDA requirements? If those are not already part of the FDA requirements, what do you consider unique to the EU MDR versus the FDA requirements?
All right. So FDA, the QSR doesn't specifically talk about post-market surveillance. It talks about CAFAs, complaints, analyzing data, and things like that. But they're not looking at you're not looking at as wide a sort of data source pool, or whatever you want to call it, as they're requiring in the EU MDR. So absolutely, you're trending already in. Hopefully, you're trending when you're looking at your complaints and CAPAs and things like that. But you're not taking into account the broad performance of that device on the market. So you're not looking at clinical data. You're just looking at what users are feeding back to you in your complaints. You're not doing literature reviews to understand any type of device performance on the market for your device or similar devices. So I'd say the current FDA requirements around trending are a small subset of what the EU MDR post-market surveillance is asking you to do.
Awesome. Okay, and we've got time for probably one last question. So how does UTMed fit into all of this?
All right. So UTMed is a database. So it's the European database of medical devices, and there's a lot of things that are going to be fit into this, including there's a summary of safety and clinical performance. That's one of the, depending on your class of device, that's one of the documents that will require to be updated as part of your post-market surveillance activities. And that is going to be submitted, or it's going to be included in the UTMed. So it's visible to the public. So that's one way that this is going to be incorporated. I'm not sure, and I'd need to find out about this, whether post-market surveillance, those periodic safety upgrade reports, as far as I know, they will not be included in Udemy, which means they're not going to be publicly visible, which makes sense because you know, you need to submit that to a notified body, and they want those to be quite descriptive. So I'm not sure. I'd have to follow up on that one. But definitely your summary of safety and clinical performance for its class 3s and implantables, I believe.
Okay, thank you so much. We have so many more questions. I know that this is a hot topic and there are so many things that we need to get answers for. We want to thank you so much, audience, for participating, for asking all of these great questions. Carolyn, thank you so much for going through all of this, highlighting some of these key things. One of our audience members did say that this is the best speaker that they have ever attended, that we've ever had. And there has been several people request that they would love to have all of these questions and answers kind of summarized and shared with all of the attendees, not just the individuals who have gone through and asked the specific questions. So we will make sure that these questions do get answered at some point. A copy of the recording will be sent out to all of the registrants for today's webinar. Carolyn, thank you again so much for such an amazing presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you for everyone's attendance.
Okay, everyone, have a great day. And again, as a reminder, because we keep having this question, we will absolutely send a recording out to the email address that you registered with for today's session. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to continuing this topic of conversation in the future.